At 4:17 a.m. on March 19, 2026, Special Agent Patricia Marchetti pressed herself against the brick wall of a converted brownstone on 159th Avenue in Howard Beach, Queens. She could hear her own breathing. Around her, in position she had assigned herself during 14 separate rehearsal runs across the preceding 3 months, 46 other federal agents waited in the dark. The temperature was 34 degrees Fahrenheit. A light rain had been falling since midnight. The street was empty. A closed pizza place. A parked delivery truck. Residential Queens, indistinguishable from any other block at that hour. She keyed her radio. All units, confirm positions. One by one, 11 confirmations came back. Miami Beach, Long Island City, Flushing, Ozone Park, Fort Lauderdale, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Great Neck, Maspeth. Each team reporting in from a different address, a different borough, a different state. All of them pieces of the same operation. All of them waiting for the same word. All units, stand by, she said. Execute on my mark. She counted to 3. Mark. What followed in the next 6 minutes dismantled the largest cryptocurrency laundering operation in the history of American organized crime. A network that had processed $3.4 billion over 6 years, a financial architecture so technically intricate that the FBI's own Virtual Assets Unit, among the most capable investigative teams in federal law enforcement, had needed 31 months and 2 outside academic consultants to reverse engineer its core design. The Genovese crime family had built something extraordinary. On a rainy Thursday morning in March of 2026, the federal government took it apart. But this story does not begin with a raid. It begins with a spreadsheet. January 14, 2022. Manhattan. Internal Revenue Service, Small Business and Self-Employed Division, 12th floor. Revenue Agent Linda Kowalski, 41 years old, 11 years with the service, was reviewing the corporate filings for a Queens-based consulting firm called Meridian Advisory Partners, LLC, routine audit. The kind she processed 8 to 10 times a month. The kind that rarely produced anything worth escalating. The numbers looked clean, almost too clean. Quarterly revenues that varied by less than 2% across 8 consecutive reporting periods. That kind of stability was unusual in consulting. Real consulting businesses have variance. Clients come and go, projects start and stop. A consulting firm that generates precisely $412,000 per quarter, every quarter, for 2 consecutive years, is either doing something genuinely remarkable or is not a consulting firm in any meaningful sense of the word. Kowalski flagged it, filed a referral, went home that evening without thinking much more about it. She didn't know she had just lit a fuse that would burn for 31 months. To understand what the FBI found at the end of that fuse, you have to understand what the Genovese crime family had been constructing for the 4 years before Linda Kowalski ever touched that file. The Genovese family is the oldest and, by most accounts, still the most durable of the 5 New York organized crime families. Their reach extends from labor unions on the Manhattan waterfront to construction contracting in Westchester County to loan sharking operations across 3 boroughs. They survived the commission prosecutions of the 1980s. They absorbed the decimation of the 1990s without collapsing. They adapted repeatedly when other families contracted or disappeared. Their longevity is not a matter of luck. It comes from a specific institutional philosophy refined over decades. Stay quiet, move money, avoid violence where any alternative exists. By 2019, however, their money-moving apparatus was under serious structural strain. The traditional cash-intensive businesses that had funded Genovese operations for generations, the numbers rackets, the no-show union positions, the after-hours social clubs with their layered cash flows, were all increasingly visible to federal investigators. New surveillance technologies, improved financial intelligence sharing between the IRS and the FBI. The RICO toolkit, honed by 3 decades of prosecutorial experience, had become uncomfortably efficient at tracing cash through conventional laundering channels. Cash was getting harder to move. The channels were getting narrower. The family needed a new financial architecture. One man was given the mandate to build it. His name was Salvatore Ferrucci, 48 years old. a capo in the Genovese family since 2017. Born in Howard Beach, raised 2 blocks from the brownstone that would later become the operational center of the FBI's 31-month investigation. The son of a concrete contractor who had served 11 years at FCY Otisville on an extortion conviction. Ferrucci was known in federal law enforcement files under several designations. His formal family name was Salvatore Joseph Ferrucci. His street name in the neighborhood was Sal. But starting around 2020, based on intercepted communications that investigators would not decode for another 3 years, he had acquired a third name among his own people. They called him the Algorithm. Ferrucci had begun studying cryptocurrency in 2018. Not casually. Methodically, with a discipline that frankly surprised the federal agents who would eventually build the case against him. Court documents filed with the Southern District of New York show he purchased over 47 separate books on blockchain technology, cryptographic protocol design, and digital asset regulation between January of 2018 and December of 2019. He attended 3 blockchain industry conferences under assumed identities. He cultivated contacts at 2 separate cryptocurrency exchanges, presenting himself as an interested investor. Over roughly 18 months, he built a foundational technical understanding of how digital asset transactions could be structured to resist forensic analysis. By early 2020, he had a plan. A clear, specific, technically grounded plan. And he knew exactly who he needed to execute it. Dmitry Kozlov was 34 years old in 2020, a Belarusian software architect who had spent the previous 6 years building financial technology infrastructure for a series of fintech startups based in Minsk, Kyiv, and eventually New York. He was not connected to organized crime in any conventional sense. No family ties, no known criminal associations. What he had was a highly specific technical competency, deep expertise in zero-knowledge cryptographic protocols and blockchain architecture, and a documented financial desperation rooted in a 2019 investment failure that had left him carrying $380,000 in personal debt. Ferrucci found him through an intermediary whose identity remains sealed in the indictment under a protective order. The introduction happened in October of 2020 at a restaurant in Flushing, Queens. According to testimony that would later form a cornerstone of the federal case, what Kozlov was offered at that first meeting was a contract to design a proprietary cryptocurrency mixing protocol, a system that would accept incoming criminal proceeds in one form, fragment them beyond recognition, route them through a series of cryptographic conversion and obfuscation steps, and deliver clean digital assets at the exit point. The payment, $600,000, structured in 3 installments. The first on delivery of a working prototype. The second on successful stress testing. The third 6 months after operational deployment, contingent on the system performing as specified. Kozlov said yes. What he built over the following 16 months would later be described by FBI technical analyst Richard Obata in his expert witness disclosure to the Southern District as, quote, the most sophisticated purpose-built money laundering protocol we have encountered in any organized crime context during the history of this unit. The system Kozlov designed operated on a Monero to Tether conversion architecture. The choice was deliberate and technically sound. Monero's privacy features, specifically ring signatures and stealth addresses, made incoming transaction tracing essentially impossible using investigative tools available to American law enforcement as of 2021. Tether, on the other side, provided the exit point liquidity needed to return value into conventional financial channels, where it could be moved through shell companies and eventually surface as clean capital. Each transaction entering the system was fragmented across an average of 23 parallel sub-transactions before any currency conversion occurred. These fragments were then routed through 14 shell exchanges registered in the Cayman Islands and the Seychelles, jurisdictions selected precisely because of their minimal regulatory cooperation frameworks with United States law enforcement under then-current treaty arrangements. The fragments were recombined at conversion points, converted into Tether, and distributed across a web of 287 cold and hot wallets, each registered to a different shell entity with a different ownership structure. The full processing cycle from input to clean exit, between 48 and 72 hours per transaction. I spent considerable time working through the technical exhibits attached to the SDNY indictment, and one architectural feature kept demanding attention. Kozlov had designed what FBI analysts later called a chain-hopping system, meaning the funds didn't simply pass through multiple wallets in a linear sequence. At each major conversion stage, the funds crossed between entirely separate blockchain networks. Monero to Ethereum, Ethereum to Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Cash to Tether. Each cross-chain hop erased the forensic trail established by the previous network's transaction record. It was, in the court's own documentary language, deliberately constructed to exceed the capability of currently available commercial and law enforcement blockchain analytics platforms. The system went operational in March of 2022. Within 60 days of launch, Ferrucci had migrated the majority of the family's financial operations into the new architecture. Labor racketeering revenues from construction projects across the South Bronx, the Genovese family controlled significant influence over two major trade locals, were generating a combined average of $62,000 per week in under-the-table payments. Those receipts now flowed directly into Kozlov's protocol. Profits from a counterfeit pharmaceutical operation running through JFK Airport's cargo handling infrastructure, a scheme that had been active since 2019, generating an estimated $4.1 million annually in fake prescription medication sales, entered the same pipeline. Loan sharking receipts, extortion collections, proceeds from a sports betting operation serving roughly 1,400 accounts across Queens and Nassau County. All of it was now flowing through a single financial machine housed in a converted brownstone on 159th Avenue in Howard Beach. A building that, from the outside, looked like nothing at all. By mid-2023, the operation was processing an average of $4.2 million per day. There was one more piece to the architecture. The piece that made the entire system defensible against scrutiny from inside the legitimate financial world. Raymond Costello was 56 years old, a former senior vice president of compliance at Cantor Fitzgerald. 17 years in institutional financial compliance. He had left the firm in 2019 under circumstances described at the time, in trade press, as a voluntary departure following an internal restructuring. Internal documents reviewed by federal investigators as part of the Iron Ledger investigation told a somewhat different version of events, one involving irregular risk approvals on a series of accounts that Costello had personally designated as low risk. The irregularities were serious enough to prompt his departure, but, for reasons that remained opaque to investigators, had not been reported to the SEC at the time. He was let go quietly. He resurfaced in the Genovese operation in June of 2022. His role, as defined in the indictment, was serving as what prosecutors called compliance architecture consultant. In operational terms, he reviewed Kozlov's technical system from the perspective of a trained financial compliance analyst and identified structural gaps, points where the architecture might flag automated monitoring systems used by legitimate financial institutions. He patched those gaps. He also maintained relationships with two former colleagues now working in compliance roles at mid-size financial institutions. Relationships that investigators believe functioned as an early warning system for any regulatory inquiries touching the family's network of shell entities. By autumn of 2022, the Genovese family had built something that looked, from almost any external vantage point, like a legitimate financial technology operation. Meridian Advisory Partners, the company Linda Kowalski had flagged in January of that year, was one layer of it. There were 11 others, each individually unremarkable, collectively forming the surface structure of a $3 billion criminal enterprise. The FBI referral from the IRS landed in the Organized Crime Division's Financial Crimes Unit in late February of 2022. Senior Special Agent Thomas Dietrich, 22 years with the Bureau, reviewed Kowalski's file. He agreed the revenue pattern was anomalous. He pulled the corporate registration for Meridian Advisory Partners and ran the listed directors. Two of the three had prior federal contacts. One was the brother-in-law of a Genovese associate the Bureau had been monitoring for an unrelated matter since 2019. Dietrich escalated immediately. What he did not know was that the case he had just inherited would consume the next 31 months of his career. Within 60 days of the referral, his team was requesting technical support from the FBI's Virtual Assets Unit in Washington. Within 90 days, they were formally partnered with VAU Special Agent Patricia Marchetti and a team of 5 blockchain forensic analysts. And within 6 months, they would understand, for the first time, the true scale of what they were looking at. The FBI's Virtual Assets Unit had been operational since 2021, assembled in direct response to the explosive growth of cryptocurrency-linked criminal activity in the preceding 3 years. Its analysts were recruited from financial crimes investigation, cybersecurity, and blockchain technology backgrounds. By early 2023, the VAU had worked asset seizure actions against ransomware groups, dark web market operators, and North Korean state-sponsored hackers. They had substantial experience with cryptocurrency tracing. They had, as of that spring, never encountered a protocol built quite like the one Kozlov had designed for the Genovese family. Their first major technical crisis surfaced in April of 2023. 14 months into the investigation, the VAU team had identified 17 wallets they believed were connected to the network through address clustering analysis, a technique that groups wallets with high probability of common control based on shared transaction patterns. When they attempted to trace funds beyond those 17 wallets, the trail simply stopped. The chain-hopping architecture was working precisely as Kozlov had designed it. Every time the FBI's blockchain analytics software followed a transaction across a cross-chain hop, the forensic link terminated. The investigators were looking at a pipeline with no readable middle section. Funds could be observed entering the system. Funds could be observed emerging from it, clean and untraceable, 3 days later. Everything in between was a cryptographic black box. Marchetti's team spent 3 months working through standard approaches: address pattern matching, transaction graph analysis, legal process served on known intermediary exchanges. None of it penetrated the architecture. The shell exchanges in the Caymans and the Seychelles responded to U.S. legal process with the same silence they extended to every foreign jurisdiction. The $50,000 Chainalysis licenses produced reports full of dead ends. What's most surprising about this phase of the investigation isn't that the FBI got stuck. Technical barriers in blockchain investigations were expected. What's surprising is the specific way they found their way through. In July of 2023, a VAU analyst named Dana Kim was reviewing academic literature on zero-knowledge proof systems as part of a continuing education project unrelated to the Iron Ledger case. She encountered a paper published in late 2022 by a blockchain security researcher at Carnegie Mellon University. The paper described a theoretical vulnerability in certain implementations of Monero's ring signature protocol, specifically when the ring size, the number of decoy outputs included in each signature, was constrained below a specific threshold by a processing system optimizing for transaction speed. It was a highly technical, niche academic point, relevant primarily to cryptographers building privacy coin implementations, not on its surface an FBI investigative tool. Kim read it twice. Then she sent a copy to Marchetti with a single line of commentary: "I think I know what they're doing." The analysis that followed took 6 weeks. Kim, working with 2 contractors hired specifically for the project, a PhD candidate from Georgia Tech and a former blockchain security architect from a private compliance firm, worked through every piece of wallet data the investigation had accumulated, looking for ring signature patterns matching the constraint profile described in the Carnegie Mellon paper. The search produced results, not in every transaction, but in a specific and consistent subset, transactions falling within a narrow value range between $14,000 and $22,000, which Kozlov's protocol apparently processed through a slightly different pathway from larger value transactions for performance optimization reasons. Those smaller transactions left a statistical shadow, not a clear forensic trail, not direct evidence of anything, but a detectable probabilistic fingerprint that, across a sufficiently large sample of transactions, could establish that a given set of wallets were connected to the same processing architecture. It was not proof, but it was a thread that could be followed. On September 4th, 2023, the FBI secured its first court-authorized access to financial institution records at a correspondent bank that had processed wire transfers connected to one of the Cayman-registered shell exchanges. The records, cross-referenced against Kim's probabilistic analysis, established a probable connection between 3 known Genovese shell entities and approximately $41 million in cryptocurrency flows over a 6-month period in 2022 and 2023. It was not the complete picture, but it was sufficient to justify the next investigative phase. The case had survived its first near-death experience. The next one would be personal. The informant that the FBI was documenting internally as Tanner was a mid-level Genovese associate who had been operating under a proffer agreement since October of 2022. The agreement had been structured around an unrelated state charge on which Tanner faced potential significant prison time. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors had agreed to recommend a substantially reduced sentence. The arrangement was, by the description of the agents handling him, working well. Tanner had confirmed the physical location of the Howard Beach operation, the approximate size of the workforce, and several key personnel names, including Ferrucci's role as operational head and DeLuca's management of the evening processing shift. In late October of 2023, Tanner went silent. 3 days passed without contact, then 5, then 10. The agents responsible for his handling made discreet inquiries through liaison contacts. Nothing. No response through the established protocols. No indication of his whereabouts. The working assumption, which could not be confirmed without investigation that risked exposing the case, was that the family had received some signal suggesting a leak close to the Howard Beach operation. Not necessarily a specific identification of Tanner, but something had prompted Ferrucci to order what intercepted internal communications described as a security review of operational personnel in mid-October, approximately 2 weeks before Tanner's communications went dark. The case team faced a genuine crisis. Tanner's testimony had become structurally important to the evidentiary timeline. If he had been identified and dealt with in the manner that organized crime organizations historically deal with informants, they had a different kind of problem entirely. If he had simply panicked and broken contact, they needed to know that too, and they could not investigate either possibility without risk of alerting the family to FBI surveillance activities that went significantly beyond the scope of anything Tanner would have known about. They waited. 11 days after the last contact, Tanner resurfaced. A brief message through the established protocol, 3 words. "I'm still here." No explanation, no request for a meeting, no additional information. He went dark again for 6 more weeks. Marchetti would later describe those 11 days as, quote, "the most professionally distressing period of my career with the Bureau." The investigation continued without him, by necessity, and found its footing through other means. But those 11 days represented the second of 3 moments when the entire case could have collapsed. A crucial development arrived in December of 2023, when a second financial institution, operating through a different Cayman entity, produced records in response to legal process that expanded the transaction picture significantly. The $41 million identified in the September records action was not a representative sample. It was a fragment. As the VAU team extended its probabilistic analysis through the winter of 2023 and into early 2024, the total figure kept growing in ways that surprised even the most experienced financial crimes investigators on the team. 50 million, 100 million, 200 million. By the spring of 2024, preliminary estimates, shared in a restricted access briefing to senior officials at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District, placed the total at somewhere between $2.8 and $3.6 billion in criminal proceeds laundered through Kozlov's architecture over the roughly 6 years the operation had been functional. The case had shifted categories. It was no longer a significant organized crime financial fraud investigation. It was what AUSA James Whitfield, in his formal case assessment memo of April 2024, described as the largest single cryptocurrency laundering enterprise ever presented for prosecution in the United States federal court system. Here's an uncomfortable point worth saying directly. The Genovese family's pivot to cryptocurrency was not simply criminal ingenuity. It was a rational response to a regulatory failure that had been visible for years before the family acted on it. The traditional financial surveillance apparatus in the United States, built over decades around cash reporting requirements, wire transfer monitoring, and know your customer obligations is architecturally incompatible with how blockchain transactions actually function. The family didn't find a loophole. They identified a structural gap that the Senate Banking Committee had held 3 separate hearings about between 2018 and 2021, all 3 of which produced reports, findings, and recommendations that were subsequently not enacted into enforceable regulation. Kozlov's protocol was technically intricate, certainly, but it was only possible to build and operate at the scale it achieved because the regulatory framework that should have prevented it didn't exist. The FBI caught up eventually, but it took 31 months and resources that most smaller investigative units could not have sustained. The next Ferrucci, working with the next Kozlov, will read this indictment as a roadmap for what to do differently. We'll say what most won't. The system that caught this operation almost wasn't resourced enough to catch it. It barely was. What do you think? Was this a law enforcement success? Or does the 31-month timeline represent a systemic failure that let $3 billion move undetected? The comments are open. We read all of them. By January of 2025, the investigation had documented 67 individual targets across the network. 3 made members of the Genovese family, 14 capos and soldiers in operational roles connected to the Howard Beach trading floor, 11 shell company directors across 3 jurisdictions, 5 foreign nationals operating in technical or support capacities, including Kozlov, Costello, and 23 others connected to the downstream criminal operations the laundering pipeline was funding, including 4 individuals central to the JFK pharmaceutical counterfeiting scheme and 7 connected to the Bronx construction racketeering. The Howard Beach brownstone itself, observed continuously through an FBI technical post the Bureau had established in an adjacent rented apartment in early 2024, was running 2 operational shifts every day. The morning crew, typically 4 to 6 individuals, arrived between 7 and 8 a.m. The evening crew, which handled the bulk of the larger transaction processing volumes, arrived around 5 p.m. and routinely worked past midnight. The building's exterior was unremarkable, a standard 2-story brownstone with a slightly heavier doorframe than the surrounding residences, visible when deliveries were made. Communications inside were conducted almost entirely through encrypted messaging platforms, primarily Signal with custom retention settings. There is a specific line in the Iron Ledger indictment that reads almost like fiction. It appears in footnote 47 of the technical exhibit attached to Count 7. It states that on December 3, 2024, at 11:43 p.m., an FBI analyst monitoring authorized investigative feeds observed a single transaction originating from a wallet within the target network, a transaction valued at $931,000 that cleared across 6 separate blockchain hops in 4 minutes and 16 seconds and appeared as a clean tether transfer to a brokerage account registered in Monaco. 4 minutes and 16 seconds. Start to finish. Nearly $1 million fully laundered. That detail stayed with me longer than almost anything else in the case file. Put yourself in Patricia Marchetti's position for a moment. You're watching this happen in real time. You know exactly what it is. You know who built it and who is operating it. You have sufficient evidence at that point to arrest most of your principal defendants. And your orders are to keep watching, to keep building the evidentiary record, to keep adding defendants until the indictment is comprehensive enough to be RICO-proof at trial. Every day you hold position, millions more move through the system. Every day, you make a choice to allow the operation to continue because the eventual takedown will be more complete. That is a difficult professional and ethical position to maintain across months of sustained surveillance. It was made significantly more difficult in late March of 2025. Network monitoring, authorized through a court order targeting traffic at one of the Cayman Shell exchanges, captured an internal communication between Ferrucci and his lieutenant Anthony DeLuca, 44 years old, from Ozone Park. The message, decrypted with NSA technical assistance pursuant to a separate court authorization, referred to a meeting scheduled for April 7th. Ferrucci described it as concerning a federal audit situation with one of the Cayman entities. He used language that indicated he was treating the matter as a potential exposure risk requiring structural response. The Cayman Shell Exchange had received a regulatory inquiry, not from American authorities directly, but from a financial intelligence coordination body with treaty-based information sharing arrangements with the U.S. Treasury. The inquiry was low-level in nature, possibly entirely routine. But Ferrucci was not treating it as routine. The April 7th meeting, according to additional monitored communications, was convened to evaluate migrating the entire network infrastructure to a new set of shell entities registered in the United Arab Emirates. New wallets, new jurisdictional structure, a clean reset. If that migration completed, the FBI's 31 months of chain of custody analysis would become substantially less coherent at trial. The evidential connective tissue linking the new entities back to the original network would have to be rebuilt from scratch. A USA Whitfield made a call on April 9, 2025. The targeted collection window that had been established to add 3 additional MAID members to the indictment was not extended. The migration could not be allowed to execute. The timeline for the arrest action was compressed. The target date for Operation Iron Ledger moved from an originally contemplated autumn 2025 window to a revised window in the first quarter of 2026, with an absolute backstop of March 31st. The FBI's best estimate of when the UAE migration would begin generating irrecoverable forensic damage to the existing case structure. They had a window. Every hour of it mattered. The planning for the simultaneous arrest action unfolded across 10 months of detailed preparation between April 2025 and February 2026. Marchetti had reviewed the operational logs from 3 prior large-scale organized crime takedowns in the SDNY district and identified the specific failure mode she was most concerned about: gap timing. In a multi-location simultaneous arrest action, any team that moves too early gives the target network seconds to communicate an alarm to the other locations. Any team that arrives late finds an alerted target and a potential flight risk. The brownstone on 159th Avenue was the anchor. 11 other locations would be hit at precisely the same moment. The Howard Beach address was also the most fortified and required the largest single team. 14 agents were assigned to the primary entry alone, with 6 positioned to cover the building's rear and secondary exits. The surveillance of the brownstone had expanded, by late 2025, to include 3 fixed observation posts, a rooftop camera installation on a building 600 feet to the east, with a clear line of sight to the target building's second-floor windows, and continuous license plate reading from a traffic monitoring camera on 157th Avenue that the FBI had arranged access to through a coordination agreement with the New York City Department of Transportation. Ferrucci's pattern was well documented by this point. He typically arrived at the brownstone between 9 and 10 a.m., entered through the building's rear entrance, and departed around 7 p.m. most evenings. Variations occurred on days he had meetings elsewhere, which were tracked through both surveillance and monitored communications. DeLuca ran the evening processing shift, arriving reliably between 5 and 5:30 p.m. A third Genovese soldier named Vincent Barbone, 51 years old from Howard Beach, managed external courier operations that moved physical documents and hardware between the brownstone and associated locations. Kozlov had not been physically observed at the brownstone since November of 2024. His pattern had shifted to primarily remote access, with occasional in-person visits for hardware maintenance. Agents monitoring his digital footprint through authorized technical means believed he was operating primarily from a rented apartment in the Ditmas Park neighborhood of Brooklyn, with periodic work sessions from a commercial co-working space in Midtown Manhattan. Costello remained the network's most externally visible figure. Observed meetings with representatives of the Cayman Shell Exchange network. Observed phone communications with one former Cantor Fitzgerald colleague, now employed at a boutique investment bank in Greenwich, Connecticut, that the Bureau believed functioned as an early warning monitoring relationship. He was watched closely throughout the final 6 months of the investigation. By December of 2025, AUSA Whitfield had 67 names on the sealed indictment. The document sat in the clerk's office of the Southern District, awaiting the date that would give it operational meaning. The final operational planning meeting for Iron Ledger took place on January 14, 2026, in a conference room at the FBI New York field office at 26 Federal Plaza. Marchetti presented the execution plan to a group that included senior representatives from the DEA, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the New York City Police Department's Organized Crime Investigation Division, and 4 officials from the U.S. Attorney's Office, including Whitfield and his supervisory AUSA. The meeting ran 4.5 hours. It was the 7th such coordination session. It was the last. The arrest teams began staging at 1 a.m. on March 19, 2026. Each team was in their confirmed position no later than 3:30 a.m. The technical team responsible for executing the court-authorized remote access action against the network's primary server infrastructure, located through 18 months of technical work at a co-location data center in Clifton, New Jersey, was on standby with a 30-second execution window beginning at 4:16 a.m. At 4:15 a.m., Marchetti received the final confirmation from all 11 team leaders. 11 locations, 47 agents plus support personnel, 3 states. All ready. At 4:16 a.m., she gave the technical team authorization to begin the server access. At 4:17 a.m., she pressed the transmit button. Mark. The steel-reinforced door of the brownstone on 159th Avenue came off its frame in 4 seconds. 3 FBI agents moved through the entry in a defined tactical sequence. A 4th broke left. 2 more secured the stairwell to the 2nd floor. The interior of the building, which surveillance imagery had shown to be organized around a central trading floor occupying most of the 2nd level, was lit by continuous fluorescent lighting of the kind that never gets turned off in rooms where financial operations extend past midnight. There were 6 people inside. 2 were identified as members of the evening processing crew who had apparently remained past the end of their usual shift. A 3rd was Barbone, located asleep on a cot in a repurposed storage area on the building's ground floor. The 4th and 5th were 2 associates identified in the indictment as targets C3 and C4, both from Queens, who appeared to be engaged in routine transaction reconciliation work when the agents entered. The 6th individual was not anticipated at this location on this date. Dmitry Kozlov was seated at a workstation in the far corner of the 2nd floor trading room. Gray hoodie, headphones. He appeared, based on the screen contents observed by entering agents and later documented in the evidence log, to have been working on a hardware security module configuration update. He had apparently been in the building since approximately 10 p.m. the previous evening, a visit not detected by the standard surveillance rotation. He did not run. He did not resist. He did not reach for anything on the desk. He looked up when agents entered the room, removed his headphones with a deliberate motion, and placed both hands flat on the workstation surface. He said, in English carrying a faint Belarusian accent, the following words: "I was wondering when this would happen." Those 7 words are in the arrest report. Across the city, the other 10 teams moved simultaneously. Ferrucci was taken at his Howard Beach residence at 4:19 a.m., arrested in his kitchen while wearing a robe. DeLuca was arrested at his Ozone Park home at 4:18 a.m., taken at the door before he fully understood what was happening. Costello was arrested in his Great Neck driveway at 4:22 a.m. He appeared, based on the arresting agent's report, to have been in the process of attempting to leave his home in some urgency when the vehicles arrived. In Miami, 2 teams encountered complications. One target attempted to exit through a 2nd floor window of a Coral Gables residence and was apprehended by agents staged in the backyard. A 2nd Miami-based defendant, a man identified in the indictment as a downstream cash management operative for the racketeering operations, was not present at his registered address. He had apparently received a communication of some kind in the preceding hour. He would remain at large for 11 days, during which his photograph was distributed to every major airport in the Southeast, before being arrested at a boarding gate at Miami International Airport on March 30, 2026, attempting to depart for Panama on a false Costa Rican passport. Kozlov was the final defendant taken into federal custody at the brownstone. By 5:05 a.m., he was seated in the back of a federal transport vehicle, his hands secured behind him. He asked the supervising agent one question as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. "How did you get through the ring signatures?" The agent did not answer. The evidence collected from Operation Iron Ledger's arrest phase exceeded initial projections across almost every metric. From the Howard Beach brownstone alone, agents documented and removed 12 laptop computers, 7 hardware security modules containing the cryptocurrency wallets that were the operational core of the laundering pipeline, $47,000 in U.S. currency, and a quantity of operational documentation that investigators later described as the most complete single-site operational ledger of an organized crime financial enterprise ever recovered by this office. The servers at the Clifton Data Center, accessed remotely at 4:16 a.m. and preserved before any deletion processes could execute, contained the complete transaction history of the network going back to its activation in March of 2022. The cryptocurrency balances recovered across all seized wallets and hardware devices totaled $847 million at market rates on the day of arrest. 23 luxury vehicles were seized across multiple locations, including 7 stored at a Maspeth facility that appeared to have been acquired as investment holdings using laundered funds. 3 pieces of real estate in Queens and 1 in Miami were placed under immediate federal seizure. The full indictment, unsealed at 8 a.m. on March 19th, named 67 defendants. 3 made members of the Genovese family, 23 soldiers and associates with direct operational roles in the Howard Beach operation, 14 individuals connected to the Shell Exchange network, Kozlov, Costello, 7 individuals connected to the JFK counterfeit pharmaceutical pipeline, and 18 others across the support and downstream cash infrastructure. The RICO charges carried maximum exposure of 20 years per count for principal defendants. Money laundering conspiracy charges added additional exposure calculated in aggregate for the highest exposure defendants to potential sentences exceeding 40 years on full conviction at trial. A U.S.A. Whitfield appeared before cameras at the U.S. Attorney's Office on Worth Street at 10 a.m. that morning. He spoke for 8 minutes. The Genovese crime family spent 6 years building what they believed was an impenetrable financial architecture, he said. Today, we demonstrated that no architecture is impenetrable. What they built to conceal everything will now be used in a courtroom to explain everything. Every transaction, every dollar, every decision. In the months following the arrests, the case moved through the Southern District at the measured pace characteristic of complex RICO prosecutions. By June of 2025, the first guilty pleas had been entered. 7 defendants, all lower-level associates, entered pleas to money laundering conspiracy charges in exchange for cooperation agreements. Their testimony, combined with the recovered server data and Kozlov's eventual cooperation, produced what federal prosecutors privately characterized as a case unlikely to produce acquittals at trial. Kozlov entered a formal cooperation agreement in April of 2026. His attorney, in plea discussions with the government, had made clear that Kozlov was prepared to provide extensive technical assistance to the FBI's Virtual Assets Unit in developing detection capabilities for chain-hopping architectures of the type he had designed. In effect, he was offering to help the Bureau catch the next version of what he had built. The government accepted the offer. The nature of the sentencing benefit extended to him in exchange has not been publicly disclosed. Costello entered a guilty plea in May of 2026. His cooperation agreement, the terms of which were filed under seal, was understood to encompass both his own operational role and his knowledge of how the early warning intelligence network he had built through his former Cantor Fitzgerald contacts had functioned. 2 of those contacts, at institutions that remain publicly unidentified, were separately referred for investigation to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Ferrucci remained silent throughout. No plea discussions, no cooperation signals. 17 pre-trial motions filed by his defense team, 17 denied. His trial, scheduled for September of 2026 in the Southern District, was expected to last 9 to 11 weeks. Looking at this case from the outside, what it tells us about where organized crime and the digital economy are heading is this. The Genovese family did not fail because they were unsophisticated. They were technically capable, arguably more so than any major organized crime enterprise that preceded them. They failed because they underestimated the FBI's capacity to close a technical gap given sufficient time, institutional resources, and one junior analyst reading an academic paper on ring signatures in a moment of unstructured professional curiosity. The 31 months from Linda Kowalski's IRS flag to the Howard Beach raid is a long time. By some metrics, It is an embarrassingly long time, given how much money moved through the network while investigators worked. But the tools developed during those 31 months, the chain-hopping probabilistic fingerprinting technique, the academic vulnerability analysis that Dana Kim adapted from a cryptography paper never intended for law enforcement use, the multi-jurisdictional simultaneous execution framework refined across 14 planning sessions will now be part of the institutional knowledge base of the FBI's Virtual Assets Unit for every case that follows this one. The Genovese family moved $3.4 billion through a system designed to be invisible. Every dollar is now in evidence. Every wallet, every hop, every shell entity. Kozlov's architecture, built to conceal, will be disassembled in a public courtroom and explained in precise technical detail to 12 jurors and a federal judge. Then it will be studied, at length, by the people who will build the next generation of investigative tools. There is something almost fitting about that. The most technically advanced criminal financial system ever built by American organized crime will survive into history primarily as a training manual for the people tasked with stopping the next one. Tanner, the informant who went dark for 11 days in October of 2023, was later confirmed to have entered hiding voluntarily after becoming convinced, based on his own read of the family's security review, that he had been specifically identified. He had not been. The security review was a routine precautionary measure, not a response to any specific intelligence about his cooperation. He resurfaced when his FBI handler made indirect contact through a trusted third party and communicated that no specific action had been directed against him. He resumed contact and continued providing information through March of 2025. His name does not appear anywhere in the public indictment. The brownstone at 159th Avenue in Howard Beach, Queens, remains under federal asset forfeiture proceedings. Assessed at $800,000, it is one of 43 properties named in the civil forfeiture action filed alongside the criminal indictment. The building's interior has been sealed since March 19, 2026. On the morning of the raid, in the hours after the initial entry teams had secured the premises and the forensic evidence collection teams had moved in, one of the agents working the second-floor trading room found a whiteboard that the surveillance cameras had never been angled to capture. On it, in neat handwriting, was a cryptographic formula that FBI technical analysts later identified as related to Kozlov's ring signature implementation. Below the formula, in different handwriting, someone had written 4 words. Nobody is watching. They were wrong about that. If you followed this channel for any length of time, you know we cover these cases because the specifics matter. Not just the arrest count and the dollar figure, but the specific choice made by a revenue agent on a January afternoon. The academic paper read by a junior analyst, 18 months into an investigation that was close to losing its thread. The 11 days when no one knew if the informant was alive. The whiteboard in the corner that no camera had ever captured. These are the real mechanics of what happened. Comment below with the moment in this story that struck you most. Was it the technical architecture? The Kozlov encounter at the brownstone? The moment Tanner went dark? If you want part 2 when the Ferrucci trial opens in September, drop Ledger in the comments. We track every response and that one determines what we build next. If this is the level of detail you want in true crime coverage, subscribe. Every week, we go deep on cases that deserve more than a headline. Federal case files. The full story.